This is going to be necessarily a very specific, very detailed presentation. There won't be a lot of slides because I want to, as much as possible, convey as much information as I can in the amount of time I have. I might mention that I'll be doing a 3-hour workshop on this same material at First Literacy in Boston in November. And that's not so much to promote the idea of that workshop, but to say that it warrants 3 hours of material. And right now I'm going to try to do the highest level presentation I can in 15 minutes. So the goal here is to provide as many specific ways as we can and as we use to prepare our students for their interviews. And I called it Teaching to the Test, a practical guide. And I did that ironically as a counterpoint to what is normal pedagogy, because teaching to the test is hardly the way we normally will go about education. But for the citizenship interview, it really is the best way to go about it. It's in fact endorsed by the USCIS on their website, uscis.gov. And that website, by the way, contains a whole lot of very valuable information and very valuable study materials for the interview. So what's the background? The overarching goals of this part of our citizenship program are to demystify the process as much as possible and thereby encourage students to relax. And when I say demystify the process, I really do mean make the students aware of everything that's going to happen from the moment they enter the building until the moment that they exit the building. Because there are assumptions that we all have, cultural and otherwise, about things that we do when we go through a similar process that many of our students are simply not familiar with. Most of you know, maybe all of you know, the citizenship interview consists of 4 components. One of those can be conceptually divided into 2, and I'll explain that in a moment. The first component is civics, and this is the component that most people think constitutes the citizenship interview. And most people think it's extremely challenging. The truth is that with the proper education and the proper study, the civics portion of the interview is not very difficult at all. You have to answer 6 questions out of a maximum of 10. There are 100 questions to study, and the questions don't change, although there was an attempt to do that a couple of years ago, but there won't be time to go into that now. So you have 100 fixed questions, 90 plus of which have fixed answers. For example, when was the Declaration of Independence adopted? Who wrote the Declaration of Independence? What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? And so forth. So we incorporate those questions into lessons about American history so the students have some context as they learn the answers to these questions. And through regular practice, whether the students are very low literacy English speakers, or high literacy, they all master it to the point where, quite frankly, they all pass civics quite readily and almost never get any answers wrong. The next 2 components are reading and writing. And the reading component consists only of reading 1 sentence out of a maximum of 3 correctly. And the sentence is often it's often a question, something like, who was the first president? When is Columbus Day? And the writing consists of the officer dictating the answer to that question. Columbus Day is in October, the president lives in the White House, and so forth and so on. So the reading and writing, while they are difficult skills to master, the actual component in the interview is not particularly difficult. So what is challenging and daunting about the interview? And that is the personal component, which is drawn from the application, the N400 form, the N400 application that students fill out with help when they apply for citizenship. And that application is 20 some odd pages long. It contains all kinds of personal information and a number of very almost invasive questions about people's background. And this is where the practice is particularly important, because if you were to look at this interview at a very high level, you would see that it is primarily a test of people's English competency. And all of these other components are simply tools for demonstrating that competency or lack of competency. So how do we approach this as a methodology? When students come to join our class, we assess them for their fluency and any relevant knowledge they might have. And then based on that assessment, they join class and they receive instruction in all of those 4 key areas I just listed, working with other students at similar levels. And we prepare them in each of those core areas to enhance their competence as much as possible. When they get an interview date, that's when we start working on applying that knowledge. And that's when they come to work with me, for example, and I incorporate all of that into a practice interview. And at some point, Ariana will put up links to 2 scripts that I created. The scripts are identical. The introductory material is slightly different, one for teachers, one for students. And you will see in those scripts, if you link to them, exactly what I'm talking about. And it would have been made the screen too busy to display them here. So that's why I'm just talking through them. What we want to do with those scripts is teach the students how to apply what they've learned in those vertical skill sets to answer questions that they're likely to be asked during the interview. So Ariane, I don't know if you have, but if you can move to that second slide. We've identified 5 keys to success in how to bring the students from that core learning to the point where they can handle the interview properly. The first one is I simulate and practice the entire interview. And by an entire interview, I do mean everything that the applicant needs to know from entrance to exit. I referred to that earlier, but what do I mean specifically? Well, since June of 2020, it meant bring masks, get used to wearing a mask for a long time and talking to people through masks. Make sure you bring critical documents. You must bring your appointment letter, your green card, and your passport, but you're probably going to need to bring other documents as well, which is something we identify as part of this process of working together. They could be birth certificates, marriage certificates, divorce certificates, and so forth. We even talk about when they should arrive, who may or may not accompany people. And then I walk them through the building, figuratively, of course, but I walk them through the building so that by the time they go to their interview, everything that's happening, they've been prepared for. They're not surprised by, because we, as I said, want to demystify the process and remove as much as possible any shocks, any surprises. So the 3 parts of the interview, that was the before part. The during part, other than those exercises that I talked about, they're going to have to take an oath to tell the truth. We make sure they understand that. They probably are going to have their photo taken and their fingerprints taken. And we even simulate removing the mask and putting it back on. This sounds very mundane, but at the beginning, some students have a little problem understanding. Doing their fingerprints emphasizes left and right. Many students get confused about left and right, especially when they're looking at somebody. And what the index finger is, which one the index finger is, because they're always asked to put their left index finger and then their right index finger. And then we practice all of those things I already talked about, civics, reading, writing, and so forth. And I then describe what happens when it's over. What happens when you're done? What does the officer do? Does the officer say you passed, you didn't pass? If you pass, what happens? If you didn't pass, what happens? So that's an overview, a schematic of the entire process. The second thing I do is I tailor the interview to the student. This is probably the single most important thing that we do. I review their actual application and I identify any vulnerable points that can be in there. And they can be any number of things. They could be more innocent things like marital history, children, and travel. Maybe more serious things like taxes or whether they've been previously excluded or deported from the US. and if they have any criminal, political, and military history. All of this, they need to be able to answer questions about, particularly if it's identified as an area in their application. The third step is engaging in necessary overkill. I think I owe Ariana gratitude for creating that phrase. And what I mean by that is that I ask them more than they're going to be asked in total during the interview. When we started doing this, we did a lot of work on definitions and clarifications of terminology. We've been performing triage as the officers seem to be asking for less and less of that. But they always ask for a few, and we never know which ones they're going to ask. So we want to practice that. If they know the definitions of the terms in the questions they're answering, it means that they can answer more confidently, and that gives more confidence to the officer himself or herself. Understand that there's a part of this application called Part 12, which is quite notorious. It consists of 50 single and multi-part questions. And the first 44 questions, the answer to them is usually no. And the last 6, the answer is usually yes. The officers know that, and the officers know that you know that. And that's why they will occasionally ask you to explain something, because they want to make sure you're not just robotically saying no, 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 yes, 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 yes. And that leads us then to the fourth step, which is mock interviews. And that's those scripts that I'm sure Ariana has posted right now. And I use those scripts. Excuse me. First, I conduct an interview in what I call teaching mode, and I use it as a teaching tool to help them understand what's going to happen and how to answer the question. Then I conduct the interview in actual simulation mode, which means I pretend to be the officer and conduct the interview accordingly. And the third way, which is now perhaps disappearing, I did that then with masks. We started using masks when the USCIS came back in June of 2 years ago. And I thought that was going to be a very challenging thing for the students, but it turned out that speaking through the mask and understanding through the mask worked very well for them. It was just uncomfortable, of course. And so now most of them are grateful to not have to use the mask. And finally, at the end, we follow up. I meet with the students just like this in Zoom. They explain to me exactly what happened. I write a comprehensive summary. If they learned or if they experienced anything that I think sounds like it's going to be generic, I add it to the script. If they experience anything that's a one-off, I simply note it in the write-up, but I don't actually incorporate it into the script. And then we ask the student to come back to class and explain to the class exactly how it went, so that they can get a sense from one of their peers what it was about. And the last thing I'll say is that, and it was sort of an amusing moment and not entirely exemplary, but one of our students came back and he wanted to tell the class how easy the interview was. And so he said to them, don't worry, the practice is much harder than the interview. And I think in terms of material, that's true, because as I said, we do necessary overkill. But in terms, of course, of their anxiety going through the experience, they don't compare. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, demystifying the process in every way, mundane and general, that we can, is how we try to make this work for our students. Denzel, I think I did it, 15.
Spot on. That was great. Thank you so much, Andy. And I really want to recognize your dedication to immigrant and refugee students over all these years as a volunteer with the Immigrant Learning Center and having developed such great materials that people can use across the country. Thank you so much for that, Andy.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.